Um, Keeping on the subject of design, there is an exhibition which will take place, if I'm not wrong, November 2020 to summer 2021, which is the Broken Nature exhibition. And so the exhibition, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but because maybe something is not 100% correct, but the exhibition will be basically the idea is to highlight the concept of restorative design, and how it can help humans and the people in general to repair or improve the relationship with the different environments. And one very important figure for this exhibition is Neri Oxman.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us something about Neri Oxman, who she is, and something more about the exhibition itself, about Broken Nature?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I will start by talking to you a little bit about Broken Nature, and then I can jump into Neri Oxman. So, Broken Nature was originally conceived as the 22nd Triennale di Milano in 2019, and it was curated by Paola Antonelli, who I work with closely here at MOMA, with a curatorial team that consisted of Ala Tanir, Erika Petrillo, and Laura Mairan. And so, as you very eloquently said in the question that you posed, the exhibition explored the idea of restorative design as a way to sort of like investigate how we might be able to repair some of the bonds that have been broken between humans and the rest of nature. And so the idea of reparative design is really one that is in constant sort of like definition. There is not really a set kind of like definition for it, but Paola kind of took inspiration from sort of like the idea of the restaurant in the 19th century. So this idea that like there is a place where you can sort of go and sort of like restore the body by drinking, sort of like a hearty soup or something that would sort of like, heat you up, that would give you the energy that you needed, but at the same time where you could sort of like be at peace and sort of like have a kind of like stimulating kind of aesthetic environment. So that is sort of like how we look at restorative design when it comes to sort of like when it comes to design. And so it goes to objects and processes and products that are able to sort of like help us repair some of these sort of like broken bonds. And when we talk about broken bonds, we really are thinking about sort of like the world and the environment as a connected system. So it doesn't just mean sort of like our relationship with nature and with other animals. It also means our relationship with each other. We sort of like look at the idea of environment in a way that understands that sort of like environmental factors will also have social, cultural, and economic implications. And so we look at projects that very much look at all these different sort of like threads that connect us with each other and other species, and that propose different ways in which we could sort of like change our behaviors and therefore repair some of the bonds that we could still repair, and if they're like altogether broken. And if you, like some people, think that humans are going to go extinct in the future, at least design can help us sort of like create a sort of like a more elegant ending. That's what Paola actually says. And so the show opened at the Triennale in 2019, as I mentioned, and then we're currently actually working on a very, very small version of it that will open at in November of this year, as you mentioned. And so that version it'll consist mostly of collection objects. So it required sort of like some rethinking and some reconceptualizing. It's also a much smaller space, and I'm happy to talk about this particular space in one of the other questions that you submitted. But it does focus on the theme, on some of the original themes that Broken Nature touched upon. So from how can design help us visualize change and therefore understand it better, because humans just physiologically in general have a very hard time understanding change as sort of like at a larger scale. And so how can design help us do that and sort of like understand that our responsibilities, that our actions now will carry our responsibilities 100 years into the future Two, as I mentioned, and I will talk about a little bit more when we talk about Neri Oxman, designers that are developing new ideas and new processes for new materials, to also ideas, for example, of empathy and how can design sort of like help us connect with other species in a way that will then sort of like teach us to behave differently. So all of these ideas were touched upon on the original Triennale, and they will be touched upon at MOMA, only at a much smaller scale.
Okay.
And so I guess to your second part of the question, Neri Oxman is an architect and designer who is also a professor at MIT, where she founded and directs a research group called the Mediated Matter Group. Neri was actually, the museum has had a really close relationship with her for a while, particularly because in 2008, Paula curated an exhibition called Design in the Elastic Mind, which looked at sort of like the relationship between design and science and how it could sort of, how that relationship could sort of like be developed without necessarily using technology as a sort of crutch. And so back then, you know, Neri was still finishing her PhD, but Paula saw her work and she thought it was great, and so she included her work for the first time in a museum setting in this institution. And ever since then, you know, she's developed her practice. She founded this wonderful research group at MIT, which is it's very much a sort of multidisciplinary research group. It includes, you know, from biologists to industrial designers to computational designers. And what they do is something that Neri Oxman coined as, she uses the term material ecology. And material ecology basically means looking at the processes of nature to create new, or looking at the phenomena of nature to create new processes within design. But unlike a lot of the designers that are sort of like imitating what nature does, what she and her team are doing very much involves kind of like engineering with nature. And so for the exhibition devoted to her and her team's work that Paula and I organized this year, actually, it just closed last week. The exhibition was called The Material Ecology. And what we decided to do was sort of highlight 7 of her projects that very much proposed new processes for construction and for creation. And so instead of highlighting these objects as sort of like finished objects, also because her work is so beautiful that it very easily tends to be read as art, we very much wanted it to be read as, or we wanted to present these projects as processes that eventually could be used not only by her and her team, but by all designers and architects that wanted to use them. And so the projects that we included or that we showed in the exhibition included, for example, agua hoja, which is a water-based manufacturing process that uses biopolymers. In this particular case, or the particular case of the work that we showed, chitin and pectin, which are very common biopolymers that you can find, for example, in the shells of a crab or in the shell of an apple, and which, when turned into a powder form and mixed with water, can be extruded through a robotic arm. And then once that solution sort of like, after it's been extruded by the arm, it mixes with oxygen. It sort of like comes into contact with the air, with the oxygen in the air. It solidifies, and therefore it allows you to sort of like create objects in what could be called as an alternative to plastic. So, for example, you could create a plastic bag that is not plastic; it's actually entirely biodegradable. Because the most important part of sort of like this process is that eventually, whatever it is that you build with it, it will decay and it will go back to the earth in a very sort of like beautiful example of circularity. Another of the projects that we included, which was actually a special commission for the show, which was called the Silk Pavilion 2. The Silk Pavilion 2 was a continuation of a project that Neri and her team started in 2013 called the Silk Pavilion. And the Silk Pavilion was basically an investigation of how we might be able to collaborate with other species, but at the same time of how we might propose better and, let's say, more humane, although that's not the right word, processes to harvest silk, because as I think Italian people know this more than other people, but the ways in which silk is harvested requires for the cocoon to be boiled so that then you can sort of like unravel the whole thread. And this, of course, kills the larva and kills the entire sort of like life cycle of the animal. And so Neri and her team realized that by conducting several experiments, they realized that if they modified sort of like environmental and geographic sort of like circumstances in which the silkworms would spin, they could get them to spin in flat patches as opposed to in the cocoon form. In particular, they realized that silkworms tend to spin upwards, and they can only achieve that cocoon form if they reach a height of 21 millimeters. If they're not able to reach that height, they will then spin fully flat, which means that they can, of course, then use or sort of like employ these beautiful animals also as construction workers and as designers in, for example, an architectural structure, which is usually the goal for them. They always want to reach the architectural scale. And so the Silk Pavilion 2 is basically a whole structure that was woven in collaboration with silkworms, with humans, and with actually a big robotic jig that would rotate. So it's quite a beautiful project. I don't want to go too much into it because it's really long, but hopefully these two examples sort of like gave you an idea of really what her and her team are doing, and how sort of like it fits our idea of kind of like developing new materials and new processes for design.
Yeah, definitely. And we've both Stefano and I, and many other people, we've watched a few videos on Neri Oxman, and it's absolutely amazing and super inspiring. And the work she does, I don't know. I honestly didn't really know a lot about this, so I was so surprised and really, really amazing. So yeah, I mean, it's great and changeable with it and with good intention. It can only go well.